Let's face it, if the finance minister were to announce the income tax changes at the start of her budget, 90% of the country would switch off after the first 5 minutes. Even they know this. So the 2.5-hour long speech first starts with the finance minister patting her government on the back, stating what a fantastic job they've done and how the economy is doing great. She then goes on and on about scheme after scheme that you have no idea about. You may hear familiar phrases like Make in India or Swachh Bharat Mission, and then suddenly also hear random stuff like foot and mouth disease in cows, or setting up another IIM in a corner of India you've probably never heard of before, or something about free buses for pilgrims, and you're left wondering, why are these specific line items being casually chucked into the middle of a speech that you thought was about national level priorities? Then, to sound cool, finance ministers tend to add a line of shairi or quote some ancient 15th century poet, and the rest of the parliament that by now has also started dozing off momentarily wakes up to make some noise.
यकीन हो तो कोई रास्ता निकलता है, यकीन हो तो कोई रास्ता निकलता है, हवा की ओट भी लेकर चराग जलता है.
The finance minister rattles off a bunch of numbers like fiscal deficit, primary deficit, tax collections, expenditure, which without context sound like someone is giving you their mobile numbers. And so by now you have given up trying to understand the budget. When the income tax changes are announced, you quickly check what that means for your taxes, and based on how much you save, you decide whether the budget is good, bad or bland. When the budget speech is over, you will find ever-optimistic industry leaders praising the government as if the budget was the next best thing invented after sliced bread. Try watching the news. There is an overload of information. News panelists sound specific and vague at the same time, and without context, you have no way to understand if they are making sense or not. And then, the day after, it's all quiet. Everyone moves on. No one bothers about the budget until a year later when the circus is again back in town. Now, for the small community of viewers visiting and subscribing to this channel, I think you deserve better. And so, when the finance minister stands up to present the budget on 1st February, I would like you to have a better idea of what to really make of it. Hello and welcome to The Bond Economist, your one-stop destination for professional advice on the economy. My name is Auradeep Nandi, and today we set the context of Budget 2025. How has the economic environment changed? What are the nation's problems? How can or can't the budget solve them? What are the key things to watch out for? As always, if you like what you see, please hit like and subscribe. And if you'd like to contribute, feel free to scan the QR code on your screen or use the super thanks button below. First things first, what's the condition of the economy that the finance minister is designing the budget for? Old Hindi movies in the 70s, 80s, 90s used to generally have three distinct parts to them. First part, everyone is happy, Babuji is smiling, Mataji is eternally setting up the table for lunch, the hero or heroine is having the most non-academic experience ever in college. Things are great. Then part 2, catastrophe strikes. The character that was laughing and smiling the most in part 1 suddenly dies. And usually it's because of a villain. Now everyone is sad, everyone is angry, everyone looks like they haven't washed their faces for a week. This goes on for a while, and then eventually the villain dies or is captured, the protagonists finally wash their faces, and mysteriously they become rich enough to own a bungalow in Mumbai. The end. The Indian economy in the post-pandemic years was a bit like the first part of these movies. There was strong pent-up demand, especially from well-off consumers. Real estate picked up materially, especially for better-off buyers. There was a massive stock market boom. Banks were aggressively lending to households. Global growth was resilient. From mid-2022 through 2023, there was a sharp fall in global commodity prices, which meant lower input costs and more profits for Indian companies. Additionally, the government was spending aggressively on infrastructure. You can see here how sharply it has been rising. GDP numbers looked great. Everyone was super confident that India's growth is invincible. Not considering the possibility that this was just a post-lockdown surge, that the economy was actually slowing down before the pandemic had struck. Maybe because they weren't watching this channel, where I had been warning since the past year that please don't get carried away by the high GDP growth numbers. All that glitters is not growth. Which brings us neatly to part 2 of the movie. The overconfidence on growth led our policymakers to take it for granted. they happily yanked all the policy levers up to tightening mode. Tight monetary policy designed for inflation control, tight exchange rate policy for keeping the rupee stable, tight fiscal policy for debt sustainability, and tight financial sector policies to curb overlending to households. All these policies, important as they are and noble as they sound, inflict a collateral damage on growth. Take, for instance, tight monetary policy. This means that the RBI refused to bring down interest rates as long as inflation did not reach the target of 4%. The previous RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das was adamant that as long as inflation doesn't touch the target of 4%, he will keep interest rates high. Doesn't matter if inflation is being caused by price flare-ups in specific food items like potatoes or atta, which the RBI has no control over. Doesn't matter if growth is suffering in the process. In fact, even when there was a sharp GDP growth drop to 5.4% in the July to September quarter from 6.7% in the previous quarter, it wasn't enough to make him budge. Similarly, the RBI was so obsessed in keeping rupee stable that in recent months it kept selling its stock of foreign exchange to fight the impact of the strengthening US dollar. So, if the RBI sells dollars, that effectively means sucking out rupees from the domestic market. The resulting shortage of liquidity sharply raised short-term interest rates. In fact, do watch the previous episode of The Bond Economist where I explain this in detail. I'll leave the link in the description. But higher interest rates also means sacrificing on growth. Same story for tightening of financial sector policies, or what in economics is known as macroprudential policy. The RBI came down like a ton of bricks on banks and financial companies overlending to households because they felt that people were getting addicted to easily available debt and were falling into a debt trap, and there was a bubble of sorts that was forming in the economy. By tightening the screws on the financial sector, the RBI starved this bubble of air, which is of course good for India's stability. But it also meant that the spooked financial sector started reducing their loans to households. The sharp fall in retail credit, of course, is going to be negative for growth. And it's not just the RBI. The government too took growth for granted. See, fiscal deficit is roughly the difference between what the government spends in a year versus what it makes from taxes and other sources. So whatever remains is what it borrows every year from banks and other financial sector players. How does it borrow? By issuing bonds. So if fiscal deficit is too high, there is an oversupply of bonds in the market, price of bonds fall, and Finance 101 will tell you that interest rates will start to rise. Meanwhile, out of control fiscal deficit, which again at the end of the day is the quantum borrowed every year, can lead to a country's national debt blowing up. That said, sometimes high fiscal deficit is also necessary for the economy. If a crisis hits a country, the government should be spending more or taxing less. But it is absolutely crucial that once the crisis is over, the fiscal excesses are drawn back. The UPA government goofed this up royally. When the 2008 global financial crisis happened, they sharply increased fiscal deficit, announcing things like farm loan waivers and MGNREGA. It was also convenient that general elections were right around the corner at that time. But after the global financial crisis passed, the government forgot to turn the tap off. So money kept flowing out of the finance ministry unchecked, fiscal deficit continued to remain elevated, creating a new crisis only a few years later when India became known as one of the fragile five and in 2013 was on the verge of a sovereign credit rating downgrade. Compare that to how the Modi government handled the pandemic. Again, fiscal deficit doubled within a year from 4.6% of GDP to 9.2% of GDP as the government went into crisis mode. But then once the pandemic had passed, the government has been steadily bringing down the fiscal deficit. And if it sticks to its commitment of bringing it down to less than 4.5% of GDP next year, then we are actually back to pre-COVID levels. How did the government manage to do this? Well, by waging a ruthless war against regular spending on government programs, wages, subsidies, etc., also known as revenue expenditure. You can see here how it has been falling as a percentage of GDP. And with the government aggressively pursuing tax revenues, trying to increase tax coverage and expanding the GST net. So, lower fiscal deficit has obviously been great for India's macro stability. But if you cut spending or are really focusing on maximizing tax collections, then some negative impact on growth will be unavoidable. So look, there are no right answers in economics. There are only compromises. So the government and the RBI have been doing this policy tightening across the spectrum for arguably justifiable causes. But they were ultimately doing these under the implicit assumption that growth would remain strong enough to withstand the negative blowback. And that is where they erred on their judgment. Visible cracks are now emerging in India's growth story. We made a video of this, I'll leave a link in the description. Essentially, the post-pandemic pent-up demand has now largely disappeared. The middle class is struggling, as incomes have stagnated, defaults have increased, credit has been running dry, and interest rates running high. Apart from some select sectors, companies aren't really investing. The government is also struggling to meet its infrastructure spending targets. At first, they said departments were not spending because the new government only took office in July, so they lost a few months at the start of the fiscal year, which starts from April. But that was July. Then we had August, September, October, November. The government's monthly fiscal data suggests pitiful capex spend. And it is in fact trailing far, far behind its annual target. They have budgeted 3.4% of GDP for the year, but to be honest, they'll be lucky to even make it to 3% of GDP. It's as if the bureaucracy has just stalled. Economists are scratching their heads wondering what's wrong. Why can't they get projects up and running? Meanwhile, consumer goods companies have been shouting on rooftops that urban consumption demand has dropped sharply. Rural consumption is supposed to be recovering on the back of robust monsoons this year. But curiously, two-wheeler sales, which is generally considered an important indicator of rural demand, hasn't really been doing all that great. In fact, if you look at all the monthly growth indicators we are getting now, on an aggregate, they don't really inspire confidence. Not surprisingly, official GDP growth estimates for the year are being progressively downgraded. The RBI initially had 7.2% for this year. That got cut in December to 6.6%. Soon after, the government's advance estimates had it even lower at 6.4%. And guess what? With 3 out of 4 quarters over, the average growth so far is tracking barely 6%. So the time for tight policies has long passed. You have to start course correction. But what does that mean for fiscal policy? So far, the government strategy has been indirect. So let's make a better business environment, and businesses will generate the investment, growth and jobs that are needed. So the government has been trying to aggressively invest in infrastructure, give incentives to manufacturing companies, reduce corporate taxes, cut red tape, try to maintain macro stability by reducing fiscal deficit. And then it turned to the private sector and went, okay, your turn. But corporates were like, Apart from a few bright spots in the economy, Indian companies aren't investing enough, aren't hiring enough, aren't paying people enough. And so this trickle down didn't quite go as planned, which means that the government now has to rethink its strategy. This rethink already started in the last budget. The government directly tried to attack unemployment by giving companies employment-linked incentives to hire first-time employees, incentivizing top 500 companies to provide internship opportunities. And I'm not sure how much progress has happened on these. Maybe they're in the process of getting launched as we speak. But clearly, this is not enough to deal with the consumption slowdown that we are facing now. So what can the government realistically do? Well, it is worth figuring out what the structure of the budget looks like in the first place. So where does the central government get its money from, and where does that money ultimately go? On the revenue side, the 3 major sources are corporate tax, income tax and GST. Around half of the government's revenue comes from them. Other receipts include money from things like disinvestment of public sector companies and dividends from the RBI. And finally, around 27% or so is borrowed, mostly from markets. So if you cut taxes or spend too much, well, it's very likely that this bar will increase. So where does all this money get spent? Well, funnily enough, 30% of it goes to states. So when you pay income tax or companies pay corporate tax, a part of it gets rerouted to state governments. So 30% of the taxes that the central government collects, it just can't touch. At some level, this feels karmic for any income taxpayer. And then there are recurring expenditures every year. Things like interest payments, defense, pensions, subsidies for fertilizers, fuel, free food to over 80 crore Indians, all of which account for nearly 40% of the budget. So if you add this to the 30% that goes to state governments, that's like almost 70% of the budget that is already pretty much predetermined. Then nearly 1/4 of the money goes to existing government schemes like PM Awas Yojana for housing, MGNREGA, midday meal scheme, Gram Sadak Yojana, crop insurance, PM Kisan, which is a cash transfer to farmers, Swachh Bharat Mission, etc. So this is 24%. Again, they can't just suddenly discontinue these programs. So actually the wriggle room for the government to announce new schemes is quite limited. So within these constraints, what can we realistically expect from the budget? So here's the dilemma for the finance minister. On the one hand, the government has already committed to bringing the fiscal deficit down from 4.9% of GDP budgeted this year to below 4.5% of GDP next year. As we mentioned earlier, this entirely reverses the pandemic-led increase to over 9% of GDP, normalizing it back to levels that was there before the crisis. So we are really close to achieving this ambition in FY26. Alternately, the finance minister could let go of the fiscal discipline that the government has maintained so meticulously for so long, which, by the way, wasn't even compromised during the general elections, and instead announce an expensive program to rescue growth. Now, some will say, sure, this is a no-brainer. Increase fiscal deficit now to tackle the growth slowdown, reduce it later when growth is recovered. The slight issue, though, is that this is often easier said than done. Say the government reduces income tax rates a lot, or say gives freebies next year. There's always a chance that it will face political backlash when it tries to withdraw it when growth is recovered. Like PM Kisan, which is 6,000 rupees being given to farmers every year, introduced in 2019, continuing up to today. There is a middle path too. The government can stick to its fiscal plan, but also offer some relief. Like say the top income tax bracket of 30% could kick in not from the annual income of 15 lakh rupees, but from 18 or 20 lakh rupees. For a lot of people who earn a lakh a month and are feeling poor, this might offer some relief. There are reports that there could be some concessions on the standard deduction side. A direct tax code could declutter and simplify the income tax law. Technically, GST rate cuts are off the table as the GST Council decides on those, which includes the states too. But the finance minister can always announce the government's intent to simplify the existing GST structure. For corporates, there is talk of reintroducing concessional tax rate for new manufacturing units, but at a higher rate of 18% instead of 15% back in 2019. I mean, it didn't really achieve much the first time around, so I'm not sure what's going to be different this time around. The government is also looking to reduce customs duties on manufacturing inputs and raising customs duties on finished goods. This is called correcting the inverted duty structure. What this means is that, let's say, LCD panels attract higher import duties, but let's say television units attract lower duties. So an Indian TV manufacturer will not only find it expensive to import that LCD panel, but when he makes the final TV, he'll have to fight foreign competition due to low customs duties. What you want is the reverse. Make inputs cheaper and maybe protect final goods industries that are struggling by protecting them from foreign competition by raising customs duties. A lot of these policies being talked of in the media may be considering this post-Trump world where manufacturing could shift to other destinations in the event of a full-blown US-China trade war. And so India is wanting to position itself to get some of that business. And of course, there are a lot of sector-specific demands people are making. I won't cover them here. But, you can argue that all of this is small fish, not enough to boost growth. There is, of course, a simpler resolution to this debate between giving fiscal support and between fiscal discipline. Stick to your fiscal targets, but at least get your departments to spend their allocated money on infrastructure. No need to even increase the share. Keep it at the same level as you budgeted this year, 3.4% of GDP. But spend this whole amount on roads, railways, ports, etc. And that might just do the trick for growth. For more such insights, like, share and subscribe to The Bond Economist.